G'day everyone, welcome back. Today I'm going to be starting the internal framing of the bus. Yay! I've had this bus for like a year now and it feels like all I've done so far is strip it out and treat rust and fix leaks, and finally I'm getting to the point where I can actually start building things inside, and it's quite exciting. So today I'm going to start the internal framing, and I'm going to start first of all with the framing for the ceiling. So this is the kind of board I'm planning to use to line my ceiling. It's a lightweight pine tongue and groove board. You can get them from Bunnings or any timber yard, and this is what I'm going to be using. Now I could just screw these things directly into the ceiling frame like that, so put some screws up through here. There's two reasons why I don't want to do that. The first one is, if you look at these beams, they've already got a lot of holes in them from where the original bus lining was clipped up into them. So if I was to try and screw my boards into these, there's a fairly good chance that the screw would go into one of these holes when you're trying to screw some of the boards in, and therefore not actually be biting into anything to hold the board up. So that makes it a little bit tricky. And the second reason has to do with insulation and trying to do what I can to minimize the amount of condensation that I get inside the bus. So anyone that's ever lived in a vehicle of any sort will know that condensation is a big problem. And I mean, the bus is basically a metal shell, and that metal shell is an excellent conductor of heat. Now I'm obviously going to be insulating the bus and doing my best to cover the metal frame and create a barrier to try and minimize heat transfer between the inside and the outside of the bus. So the insulation I'm going to be using will help with that. The timber lining itself will also act as an insulator because it doesn't conduct heat as well as the metal frame. But if I was to screw the timber directly into the metal frame using metal screws, then each one of those screws is now creating a thermal bridge where you can get heat transfer straight from the metal frame to the inside of the bus. The size of a screw may not seem very much. If there's going to be multiple screws in every single one of these boards into the roof, that's a lot of screws where you can get transfer of heat and then run the risk of condensation forming on all of those screws and dripping down into the bus, which I don't want. So in order to try and avoid that, what I'm actually going to be doing, and what a lot of people do, is to actually put some pieces of timber up alongside the roof frame, and it'll be those timber pieces, not the metal frame itself, that these boards will screw into. So the timber I'm going to be using is the same kind of timber that I use to make the frames for my Max Air fans. It's just lightweight dressed pine, and I'm using pieces that are 30mm by 42mm. And the reason I'm using that size is because this depth here is almost exactly 42mm, so I can put those pieces just neatly up there. They'll sit flush with the metal frame. I could, and I have seen some people, rather than putting it on the side of the frame, actually screw it up into the bottom here. But again, I've got the issues of all these holes, so you have to make sure that you're screwing, you know, in between here. There's not a lot of meat left to screw into. But also the main reason I'm not doing that is because you can see that would take a fair amount off my head clearance, and as you can see I'm 5'9" and I'm already just about touching the ceilings. So whatever I put on the ceiling, I want to try and minimize the thickness of it because I want to try and keep as much of this head clearance as possible. So I'm going to be using these pieces, and my plan is to screw them into the sides of these main structural beams in the roof, and I'll have to cut several small pieces because these beams are actually curved and I want to make sure I'm still flush with the bottom of them. So I'll just cut several pieces so that I can match the curve of the beam, and then my boards will actually be across here and screwing up into the timber. Now it gets a little bit tricky as you come further out to the edges here, because obviously this is a much steeper curve, and also the way that the frame is structured, there isn't really a lot here to actually screw into. So what I want to actually do is get a piece that will screw onto here as well as up here. So something like that. Later on, I'm going to be wanting to install overhead shelves on both sides of the bus. And the way I'm thinking about doing it is I'll have one end of the shelf screwed up under these pieces here, and then I'll have another piece, another vertical piece that'll be screwed into the roof here coming down, and the shelf will be kind of screwed into that as well. If I was to screw the base of my shelf directly into this as it is here, you can see it'd be on quite a ridiculous angle. And what I obviously want is for the shelf to be at roughly 90 degrees. So what that means is I'm going to have to try and cut this on an angle so that later on, when I come to screw in my shelf, this will be nice and flat, and my shelf will just screw up into that. So I have this piece of timber clamped so that it's 90 degrees at the floor, and I've got this one clamped onto it here, so it's 90. So I know this is 90 degrees here, so this is where I would want my shelf to sit. So now what I need to do is work out what this angle is here, because if I'm going to want to put a piece of timber down here, I need to know what angle to cut it there so that it'll sit flush up against my timber shelf. And the way that I do that is, now that I know that this is sitting nicely at 90 degrees, I'm going to get my bevel tool and just measure this angle in here. So this is the bevel tool that I'm using. This is an old one that my dad had. You can probably get newer, fancier looking ones than this now, but this will do the job. So what I need to do is just sit that flat on there and push this up until it's sitting up against here, which is the angle I want to come down, and it is. I'm going to tighten this. Just tighten this all the way up so that can't move. I'm just going to double check that again. Sitting nice and flush in there. So now I know that there is the angle, so I'm going to go and get my protractor and measure exactly what that angle is. So there's the old high school protractor, still going strong, and I can see that that angle is near enough to 70 degrees. Now if I was only cutting one or two of these pieces, I could just use the bevel itself to mark the line and then line up the saw with that line, and then that would give me the correct angle. But because I need to cut quite a few of these and I want them to be as accurate as possible and all the same, I'm going to set it up on my miter saw. So because I know that the angle I need to cut is 70 degrees, I can set my miter saw to 20 degrees, because 90 minus 70 is 20, and that'll give me the correct angle. So I set my miter saw up to 20 degrees, and then I can go ahead and cut all the pieces, and they should be all the same angle. So now when that's screwed onto there, you can see that that's the right angle now. So what that means is I should be able to cut these pieces to the same angle, and when they're screwed on there, as long as I screw them all at the same height on the wall, I should be able to later on screw my overhead shelf up underneath them. So in order to make sure that I do screw all of these pieces to the wall at the same height, I'm using my square edge to actually mark a line, and it just happens that the square edge is just the right size to be able to clamp onto this part of the frame and give me a nice straight line, pretty much where I'm going to want my shelf to be. So now that I've marked that line, I can work out exactly how long these pieces need to be and go ahead and cut them to the right length. And I'm sealing all of these with a couple of coats of the Cabothane Clear Sealer, just to protect them from moisture and hopefully prevent any damage down the track. So now I've got all my pieces cut and they've all had 2 coats of the Cabothane Clear Sealer. So now I can go ahead and screw them into the bus frame. And I'm going to do these pieces the same way I did the frames for the fans, in that I'm going to glue the pieces on with some Sikaflex and then screw them into the frame using self-drilling metal screws. Okay, so I've managed to get most of the timber pieces in the ceiling up. Pretty much all of the main part of the center frame is done, but I ran into a problem when I came to screw in the side pieces. So you'll remember that my plan for these side edges was to use these angled pieces of timber, and I was going to attach them so that they were like this, so the top of them screwed into the ceiling beam the same way that these pieces do, and then this part down here was going to screw into here, lining up the very bottom edge with that line that I'd drawn. Now the problem that I had was when I came to do that, I realized there isn't actually anything here to be able to properly clamp this piece on to hold it in place while I was screwing it in, because there's only a very narrow little ridge here that's maybe, I don't know, not even, maybe a ½ an inch deep, that you may be able to put a clamp onto, but clamping it there kind of pulled it out away from this angle here, which is where I wanted to screw it into. And likewise, because these channels that the roof beams are made from are also not square, they're actually angled out. Clamping it, trying to clamp it on up here just meant that it kind of wanted to pull it in this way and wasn't holding it in the right position there. And so the thing was jumping all over the place as I was trying to screw it in. And I just realized that in order for this to work, all of these pieces absolutely needed to be nice and straight and exactly on that line, so that when I came to screw in my overhead shelf up underneath them, you know, they were all pretty level and I would be able to do that. And I just realized that it's going to be incredibly difficult just because of the nature of this frame here, and there's really nothing to clamp onto. It was going to be incredibly difficult to, first of all, to even screw these pieces in without making a complete botch-up job, but also trying to get them all perfectly neat and straight in position was just going to be crazy. So yeah, so I decided to ditch that idea and we'll try and think of something else. So I wish I'd realised that before I went ahead and cut all these pieces and got them all at the right angle and everything. But anyway, at least now I'm sure there'll be other parts of the build where I will need to cut angled pieces, and at least now I know how to do that. And I'll certainly be able to use these pieces elsewhere. So it's not the end of the world, and it's just one of those things. Unless you've got a lot of experience doing bus conversions, there will be times when it's a bit of trial and error, and something that you had thought was going to work won't always necessarily work out, and you need to change the way that you do things, and that's just how it is when you're converting a bus. So I'm going to have to come up with another way to do the overhead shelves, and I've already got a few ideas in mind. I'm actually thinking now, rather than having an open shelf, I might go ahead and make them actual cabinets, because I think I'll be able to store more things in there if I do it that way. So for now I'm going to leave that bit though and just focus on the main part of the ceiling, because I can lay my ceiling boards in this main center part, and then I'll be doing something a little bit different for the edges. So that will be a later job, but for now I'm pretty happy with the way the main ceiling strips are in, so they're ready to lay the boards when I come to do that. And the next step is my insulation, and that will be next week's job, because I am picking up my insulation tomorrow, which is very exciting. Feels like I'm finally starting to make some real progress on the inside of this bus. So before I go, I just want to give a quick update on the progress on my floor, because if you saw my previous video, you'll know that I had some issues with mould in the floor of the bus, and a couple of weeks ago I sanded it back and painted it with oil of cloves, and so far the results are looking pretty promising. So it's a bit over 2 weeks since I treated the floor, and as you can see, it's still looking pretty good. It looks pretty much as it did after I sanded it back. So certainly I haven't noticed any of the mold coming back and getting worse again. Not like it did when I tried it with the vinegar. So in this back corner here, you'll remember when I sanded it back and painted it with the vinegar, a week later, there was more mold visible again. But you can see this time, this back corner is still pretty, I mean, there's still staining from the mold and stuff that was there before, but it looks pretty much as it did after I sanded it and then I painted it with the oil of cloves. 2 weeks later, there's no sign of the mold getting worse again. So I think it has actually done the trick. The floor certainly looks better. So overall, I think the oil of cloves has worked pretty well. Now, I need to caveat this by saying that the bus is no longer parked in the shed where it was when it got the mould. And we've also, since I treated the floor, had some quite warm, sunny days. So the conditions now are not quite as good for mould growth as they have been for the last quite a few weeks. So it may be that it's just not the right conditions now for the mould to grow. Maybe that's what's slowing it down. But it seems like the oil of cloves has actually done the job. So I'm going to leave the floor as it is for now and continue with some other parts of the build. Just before I'm ready to lay the vinyl floor, I will probably give the floor another sand, and I might even sand it back a little bit more than I did last time and give it another good coat with the oil of cloves, and I think that will be enough to stop the mold coming back.